everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us again. Uh, Welcome to this first session of three series of events that we're going to be hosting for pre-law students. This is the Law School Application Overview hosted jointly by the Career Center and the LNS Office of Undergraduate Advising. And we'll be doing a quick round of introductions, but we'll first be giving you a very general overview of the things we're going to be covering today. So, like I said, we'll be doing brief introductions just so you know who we are. And of course, we're going to talk a little bit about timelines for those of you that are thinking a little bit about what kind of planning process you should be thinking about as you think about applying for law school. We'll talk a little bit about the different components that come with the application process to give you some tips and things to think about as you prepare for the process, even if you're just starting and exploring the law school pathway. And then we're gonna leave question and answer time for the end. So you may want to be able to, you have the option to chat in questions, but just know that we're gonna be answering them until that portion of the presentation, which will be towards the end of the session. We're trying to leave as much time as possible for that. But yeah, Kelly, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for being here with us on this Wednesday. My name is Kelly and I'm the pre-law advisor at the Career Center. We know that this is an extremely stressful time for many folks, so we're glad to have you here and we're happy to support in any way that we can.
And the guy that's been rambling on for a little bit already, my name is Ulises Serrano. I'm a college advisor with the LNS Office of Undergraduate Advising, and I'm also the pre-law advising lead for the office. It's part of our larger pre-professional advising services that were just recently unveiled a couple weeks ago during the GBO for the new incoming class of 2024 and the class of 2022 for transfers. So hopefully we'll get to meet you all throughout your time here at Berkeley. And we're going to get started.
So I'm going to quickly go over the timeline. Keep in mind that we, like Ulysses mentioned, we have a Q&A session towards the end, so please hold your questions until then. So the law school process really starts with, career exploration, right? So as you probably know, it's a big financial commitment, it's a big time commitment as well. So thinking through this and making sure that this aligns with your long-term career goals is very important. So what we recommend you do is just gather a little bit of information through informational interviews and such. And some ways you can do that are through the Berkeley Career Network and then also the LinkedIn alumni feature. So the Berkeley Career Network is great because Cal alums actually specify on their profiles how they want to support students. So some of them will say like willing to give career advice on X or willing to look over your resume and give you feedback. So I would really recommend checking out that tool, and it's free. And then the other thing is the LinkedIn alumni feature. So what you could do is search by law school, search by firm, search by major, etc., and find a list of folks or profiles of folks who are both Cal alums and are in the career fields you're interested in learning more about. And then just asking some questions, start by outreach, in that section or session. You just want to message them and say like, hey, I saw you're a Cal alum and I really want to learn a little bit more about your career journey. Do you have 15 to 20 minutes just to chat with me briefly and answer some of my questions? And then from there, I would recommend asking questions such as, if you could do this all over again, what would you do differently? What were some things you wish you had known before you jumped into the law school application process, or even, before you entered law school? I think you'll be able to gather a lot of great insights. And then the other thing is attending some of our pre-law events. We'll talk about that at a later slide, but just coming to some of our career connection series where you can build connections and learn about folks in the field and such. And then after you've kind of solidified that this is something you want to step into, it's time to start planning. So a couple of major things include the LSAT, the law school admission test, thinking about, when do you want to take it, and then mapping out how much time you want to give yourself, which is usually around 3 to 6 months of prep time. And then the other portions or other components include the personal statement and other written application material. So there's obviously the personal statement that asks you to answer like, why law school? Like, why are you choosing this as your career path and why are you applying. And then there are also supplemental essay questions. I like to tell students that they're kind of similar to those Common App questions if you remember them. You know, if you could teach a class for a day, what topic would you teach it on? You know, who's your favorite character from your favorite book or movie? Why do you identify with that person or character, and such? And then there's the optional diversity essay. So this one is asking you what unique perspectives, lens do you have that you can contribute to the incoming class? So just some things to think about. And then just keeping in mind that applications open up roughly September 1st or so. Schools will have varying dates and whatnot, so kind of keeping track of that is important. It's on a rolling admissions basis, which means that law school admissions officers will read those applications as they come through in sort of waves or cycles, right? And so you won't be hearing back like all at once. You'll hear back, you know, in waves essentially. And then the other thing is letters of rec. So thinking about, you know, professors or GSIs on campus that you can start to build relationships with or strengthen existing relationships so that they can be potential letter of rec writers in the future. And I think I mentioned this before, but you'll need about 2 academic letters. Some schools will allow up to 4. That's completely optional, but 2 academic ones are what you need. And then requesting transcripts to be sent through LSAC. So if you've attended a community college or had high school credits transferred in and whatnot, you need to send all of that over to LSAC. And with the credential assembly service, which we'll talk about in depth later, they'll bundle everything and it'll save you a lot of time through that service. And then lastly, it's just setting a personal deadline. Give yourself roughly 2 weeks before the actual deadline for which you need to submit everything, just in case, you know, there's a hiccup, you don't get your letters of rec on time, etc. So that is what the timeline roughly looks like.
So gap time or gap years, right? I think when we talk about timelining or just figuring out around when should you start your preparation process, you really also want to think about gap time. This is actually something that comes up quite often when it comes to advising students on a one-on-one basis. And of course, there's differing opinions on it, but just know that increasingly more so than ever before, schools are actually interested that students take some gap time. That could really range from 1 to 3 years. It could be much longer than that. And the reason why schools are increasingly more interested in students taking gap time is because they want students to come in with professional experience. And that professional experience can look differently depending on the student. And of course, as the slide notes, right, students can use this time to either take on legal or non-legal jobs. They can volunteer for service organizations. So it could be either things like the Peace Corps. Some students maybe are interested in teaching, so they do things like TFA. So anything pertaining to public service at that scale. Some students will actually decide to pursue other graduate programs first, whether that be master's programs, or perhaps even think about joint programs at that time and really try to strategize around preparation for both the JD and those other graduate programs. Or sometimes students just want to take a break, right? We know that Berkeley, for example, can be quite a draining and stressful space at times. And it's totally okay for you to take that time because you want to make sure that when you're starting your next professional school journey or graduate school journey, you want to be as reinvigorated, right, as possible so you can really fully devote yourself to that process. So as you think a little bit about gap time, definitely think about it critically and don't feel like it's going to come at a disadvantage, because I think often students feel the pressure to apply and go to law school immediately after undergrad, but that's not necessarily always the best, right, depending on your situation. And it actually could be very beneficial that you take the time to really explore things a little further during those gap years or gap year if you decide to take some gap time. But definitely something that I actually advocate for, since it could really be very beneficial.
So next, I'm just going to quickly talk about LSAC and CAS. CAS stands for Credential Assembly Service, and LSAC is the Law School Admissions Council. They essentially administer the LSAT. They also provide resources such as Khan Academy, which is free LSAT prep, in an effort to make test prep a little bit more accessible. Because as you probably know, test prep can be very pricey, upwards to $1,000–$2,000. So Khan Academy is a great service to use. And then they also have, various diversity initiatives, as well as, they do workshops and training and all those different things. So be sure to look on their website for that information. And then the last piece is the credential assembly service. So what it is in a nutshell is it simplifies your application process. It takes, because students will apply on average to about 9 to 13 different schools. And so you really don't want to be sending letters of rec and transcripts and all of those things to each school. So they kind of bundle everything up. They send what's called a law school report to each school that you're applying for. And so it simplifies the entire process for you. And all ABA approved law schools have applications available through LSAC. And so to give you an idea of what it looks like, these are sort of the fees through LSAC. So the LSAT, the exam, is $200, and then the credential assembly service, or CAS, is $195, and then each law school report is $45. And then there's a separate application fee for each of the law schools. And what that is it's a fee for the admissions officers to look over and read your application material. So as you probably can see, it's pretty pricey and can, really add up. So plan accordingly. And then also just know that LSAC offers fee waivers for folks who, are low income and such. So plan ahead for those as well.
So when it comes to exams, right, since the exams are a core component to this process, just want to make sure that you take the time that you need to study. And obviously you want to give yourself how much ever time you need, but the general time frame we see students take to study for either the LSAT or the GRE is 3 to 6 months. And I say either or because increasingly more so, law schools are also taking the GRE in place of the LSAT. So depending on the school that you're thinking about applying to, you may want to be strategic about which exam you take, right? Or which exams you decide to have to take, depending on the school you're applying to or the schools you're going to be looking to apply to. So you want to make sure you do that research early on. And of course, we definitely encourage students to take test prep courses. We know that often it's a rigorous process just to try to get yourself in test prep mode, right? So it does take a bit of planning, and the test prep can actually help you with really just creating a schedule, having that additional support whenever you need it, to ask questions about the different components of the LSAT or the GRE. And of course, recognizing that it can be costly, but as Kelly mentioned earlier, the Khan Academy, for example, offers a free means of getting test prep support, and there's also other low-cost options. And then just another point to make, not all schools will take both exams. So again, you want to do that research early on. Learn about the differences between the two and the way that the scoring looks for both, because it is a different scoring system for each. The GRE is a lot more widely available than the LSAT, so that's something to think about. And with the LSAT, they generally will be reporting all scores to the schools that you're going to be applying to, versus the GRE, which actually allows you to decide which scores you want to send in. So you would want to definitely make sure you do a little bit of research on that to see which one you should maybe take first. But yeah.
And I'll just add a little bit to it. Yeah, definitely give yourself ample time, but don't give yourself too much time, like say a year, because you definitely don't want to be burnt out. And with the LSAT, you want to just try to take it one time as possible, unless, there's some unforeseen circumstance, family emergency, etc. And then as far as studying, some students need, a little bit more structure. So they turn to a test prep course, like a live online course. And then for other students, they know they just can self-study. And so they'll buy like the Power Score books or whatnot, and they'll just kind of dissect those and do them over and over again. So see what works best for you. I kind of commonly share with students, before you start prepping, take a few diagnostic tests without any prior studying and see kind of how you do consistently. So maybe take 2 or 3 of those exams just to get yourself a little bit familiar with the test, and then go from there and decide, do you want to do test prep course or do you want to self-study? And then there are some test prep courses like Blueprint, which you don't have to commit to an entire course. You could go on a monthly basis. So there are programs that offer that. So just look into your options before committing to something. And then the next thing I'm going to be talking about is personal statements. So the personal statement is just a document. It's 2 to 4 double-spaced pages. Commonly, it's about 2 double-spaced pages. And it's asking you to answer the question like, why law school? The prompt is pretty much the same across the board. And because the prompt is so broad, students kind of feel like, I don't know where to start, or I have so many things I want to talk about and don't know which one to kind of hone in on. So first, just understand what the personal statement prompt is, right? So why do you want to go to law school? Who or what motivated your decision to apply? What experiences during undergrad really kind of propelled you in this direction? Or alternatively, what qualities or characteristics do you possess that would make you a successful law student? Those are just some different things to think about. And your personal statement shouldn't be just a carbon copy of other pieces of your application components, such as your resume or other pieces like, you don't want to include your GPA. You want to highlight things that are already not included in those other documents. So just making sure that there's a differentiation. And then this is another opportunity for you to showcase your personality and also reflect on your previous experiences. So all of those things can be touched upon. So these are just some questions. I'm not going to obviously read them all to you, and we will be sending this slide deck after. So some questions to get you started. What are some challenging things that you've overcome and experienced and overcome? What were your fondest memories from your undergrad experience? What qualities do you most associate with law? Like, when did you start thinking about this as a career path for you? Who's had a significant role in this decision-making process for you? So start, by just bullet pointing some different ideas. And then with the personal statement, you want to have a couple of folks read it and just give you feedback. I would typically recommend 2 to 4 folks, including someone like an advisor like myself or like a GSI, and then maybe 1 or 2 friends who know you well, right? So that they can, see like, okay, are you missing something? Is there something you haven't included? Or are you being redundant and whatnot? But you don't want to get too many perspectives because then it starts to dilute your original thoughts and ideas. So 2 to 4 is a good position. And just start by thinking about these questions on the screen. And maybe you want to draft something up and, send it to us and, set up an appointment. We're happy to support you with that. And then the next thing is letters of recommendation. So as I mentioned previously, really quickly, they're requesting 2 letters that are academic, professors or GSIs. One common thing that students do, because they know it's such a large campus, is students will actually reach out to GSIs and have the GSIs maybe write the bulk of the letter. And then sometimes the professors will add a little bit at the bottom and co-sign the letter or just co-sign it. Those are just some options for you, but obviously completely optional. With the letters of rec, we're focusing more on content than say the prestige or the name of the professor or whether they're tenure track as opposed to being a lecturer. So please just remember to focus on the content. And then because law schools allow up to 4 in some cases, students oftentimes will have a 3rd letter of rec come from an employer, supervisor, whatnot, to kind of make that application more well-rounded. But again, this is optional. They're mostly focused on the first 2 that we mentioned. And then resume. So resumes for law school really aren't that different from one that you would use to apply to a job, except that they would be a little bit more academic focused here. So if you have research projects or like if you've done URAP positions, different things like that, or even larger class projects that are academic in nature, you probably want to include that, just by creating a project section on your resume. So really not all that different, just making sure that you keep the reader in mind, which is an academic an admissions counselor. And again, content over formatting, you don't need to do any crazy colors or different fonts. It's just a pretty straightforward traditional resume. And with the resume, you can go up to 2 pages. Don't have to stick to the one if you know, have other experiences that you want to share, or if you take a couple of gap years and you want to include different things. Just making sure that like the resume makes sense. You're not providing too many things on there that's kind of confusing or hard to follow. But definitely feel free to go past the 1-page limit that we usually tell undergrad students who are applying for jobs.
Before I go into the transcripts and courses piece, something I did want to plug in too pertaining to letters of recommendation, just know that generally when students take gap time, whether that be a year or a couple of years, there's also a little more flexibility for students to submit less academic letters generally, right? Because there's this understanding that if you're away from school for some time, it might be difficult to sustain a relationship with a GSI, with a professor. So in those scenarios, there is a little more wiggle room for you to actually get more supervisory letters that can really speak to the kinds of contributions you could bring to the law school that you're applying to. So just wanted to make a quick note of that. So transcripts and courses. So this is something that I know for sure I often will be focusing a lot on the academic side. And grades are important, as you all know. GPAs, I'm not denying the fact that it is a critical factor in this process, but it's not the only factor, right? You ultimately want to make sure you're a holistically well-rounded student, right? Whether that be, making sure that you have strong letters of recommendation, you have a strong personal statement, your resume is it's essentially solid, and you've had a varied amount of experiences that you're able to tap into to demonstrate your passion and interest in law. So making sure that you do well academically definitely is important, and that's where the academic piece is critical, that you're checking in with folks in advising, whether that be myself or other people in LNS, or if you're not an LNS student, making sure you're checking in with your college or major department just to make sure that they can work with you to make sure that you're getting the support you need to be successful academically. And this is also another piece that I often spend time in, right? What major is the most ideal, and what classes should I be taking to be able to better prepare? Just know that schools have no preference for specific majors or how many majors you decide to take on, and there are no prerequisites. Often students, I think that the more majors you have or the more minors you have, that's suddenly going to make you a more competitive candidate, and that's not actually the case. Ultimately, it's better that you do well in one major versus overextending yourself with 2 majors and not doing as well academically as you could have with just one major. Same with minors, or same with you trying to do more than 2 majors, because we often will also see, or once in a while, we'll see students trying to take on more than 2 majors. So it's just something to think about. And then in terms of course exploration, you want to maybe consider taking classes that pertain to the legal field of study that you're interested in, right? So if you're interested in, say, environmental law, maybe you want to be taking some environmental policy and management courses, right, to explore the environmental piece to policy making and law making. Or students are interested in immigration law, maybe take some classes on immigration, because there are a couple throughout different departments. You're interested in criminal justice and criminal law, maybe you think about taking some courses surrounding that topic or area of interest. So there's definitely ways you can align your classes to your legal field of interest. And that's something that I often encourage, just so you can also get more exposure to the topic or area of interest that you have. And then, of course, that last piece around academic difficulty. You're dealing with incompletes. You're dealing generally with any kind of issues with regards to your academics. You want to check in with us either in LNS advising. You want to check in with your major advisor. You want to talk to someone to make sure that you're getting what you need to be successful, and that you're getting any other supports that might be necessary depending on your circumstances. And then school selection, right? So out of this whole process, you want to make sure you're actually strategic about school choice and just doing research on schools. I've had a couple students who have come up to me and have told me, I want to apply to law school, but they haven't even looked at schools. And I think that is a little backwards, in the sense that if you're trying to apply to law school, you first want to do research on schools, right? Before you start to actually try to initiate the process. because you want to make sure you know what you're going to be getting yourself into as you delve into the process. So you want to think about what makes the right fit, right? Quote unquote. And I say that in quotes because fit looks different for each student, right? So whatever fits for you or whatever is the right fit for you might not be the same for every other person, say on this session today, right? So some things you want to think about when you're thinking about fit, you know, what does financial aid look like, right? Is the bar passage rate for that school high or not? Is there specific faculty you would want to work with, or specific clinics perhaps, or journals that you would want to maybe be involved with? Is there support for jobs placement after you graduate, so you can make sure you're actually hired somewhere before you graduate? Uh, are you interested in practicing law in a particular location? You maybe would want to think about attending a school in that particular location or in that state, for example. Is there a specific school size that you're looking into? Are you looking into a large cohort-based school versus something that's a little more small and intimate? And then, of course, looking into things like campus culture and whatnot. So in this process, something that you want to definitely be thinking about, and I know Kelly does a lot of these conversations too with students, or has a lot of these conversations, is making sure that you're also casting a wide net, right? You want to make sure that you're really aiming for the top schools, right? You're coming to Berkeley, you should absolutely be aiming for the top schools, but you should also think a little bit about what is readily accessible depending on your situation, and also maybe even have some in your pocket that you know you can probably get into, right, based on your profile. So if you need help with that process and really trying to hone in on some of those schools depending on where you are, you definitely can come talk to either Kelly or I, and then we can help you with that process.
And then just really quickly, we wanted to highlight some resources for you. The Career Center has a pretty robust website. It's called the Law School Overview and Timeline page. The link is on the screen, and again, we'll be sending this PowerPoint out, but I think it has some great resources. It's very text heavy, I will admit, but it goes over all the different components and breaks it down. And then there's also a page called Is Law School Right for Me? So if you're at the very initial, stages of exploration, there are some suggestions, including informational interviewing, how to, go about that, and some different tips as well. So I would recommend that. And then there are some pre-law podcasts we recommend. So the first one, I'll speak to that one. A colleague at Baylor who works with undergrad students created this podcast, and he actually has his JD and was a practicing attorney, but is now a pre-law advisor. And so he has a great network, and he brings in folks to talk about different things like, what is it like to be a corporate lawyer in New York City, or what is it like to be a federal judge, different things like that. So I would really recommend checking that out. And then Harvard also has a similar one, so the link is there. And then Ulysses actually created this introductory guide to law school, and we can send it to you all as a PDF form after. But it has some really great resources, very in depth. There are some different internships you can look into, breaks down all the different components. Ulysses, you want to speak on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so real quick plug also for the podcast. Just so you know, that's actually a podcast that was recently started by the admissions deans of Yale and Harvard law schools. So they're going to be talking a little bit about what it takes to apply, right, to a major law school, one of the top 14. Obviously, as you know, Yale and Harvard and Stanford tend to be the top three. So it might be really cool to listen in to what they have to say as admissions deans from some of the top schools, to get a better sense of what you should be doing to prep for the process. And then the intro guide, like Kelly said, it's a PDF file. It's quite lengthy and purposely comprehensive, so you can really just dive in to have the most fundamental information of what it's going to take to apply to law school. So if you're looking to learn more about test prep resources, learning more about financing law school and what are your options, professional experience opportunities. As you can see on the slide, there's some examples there of organizations you can get involved with in the Bay Area, student groups you can get involved with as well if you're interested in getting involved on campus. So it's a really comprehensive, I would say, or I try to make it as comprehensive as possible. So I hope that it comes in handy for you all as you think about your paths. And and then in terms of events, so like I said earlier, I briefly noted we have a couple more events coming up. So this is really just to be a general overview. It's not going to answer. We're hoping that we can answer as many of your questions as possible, but we might not be able to within the time that we have allotted. So we hope that you do follow up with us in the future via advising. But we'll also be having the rest of our time for Q&A. So if you're interested in us answering questions live, we can definitely do that. The upcoming event we're actually going to be hosting is the law school admissions panel. So we're going to be having admissions officers and deans or directors from schools like Harvard Law, UCLA Law, UC Davis Law, University of Washington, and I feel like I'm missing one. University of
Michigan.
Michigan. University
Yeah.
of Michigan. So we'll be having those folks come and join us so they can talk a little bit about admissions from their standpoint as admissions officers and directors. So they are the ones that are reading the applications, right? So who better to ask about law school than those people that are actually reading applications and are making decisions about who gets to be admitted to their schools or not. So we're hoping to really, make sure that you all get as much content knowledge from that session as possible. So hopefully you all can join us. And then the last one will be on October 19th, which is a professionals of color in the legal field session. And Kelly and I were really trying to be intentional about a session like this because we know that the landscape for folks of color in the legal profession is very difficult to navigate at times. Um, I often tell students, right, that the legal profession is unfortunately one of the least diverse professions in the country. And I think it's important to recognize that because that's ultimately what students are going to get themselves into if they're going to be trying to practice law. So we're hoping to bring this session for the sake of you all to get a sense of what it's like to actually practice law as a person of color. So that'll be on October 19th from 3 to 4 p.m. And we're working to get panelists from different sectors of the profession. And then I'll let Kelly talk a little bit about some of the other Career Center events.
Yeah, and because I support also students who are interested in government and policy, there's a career paths in government and policy on October 15th. It's going to be a panel. And then the last one is a career connections event for government, public service, and law. And what the career connections events are. We usually bring in about 12 to 15 alums and professionals. And usually we host this in the blue and gold room at the Career Center, and students just kind of go from table to table and ask their questions. How did you get to where you're at now? What tips do you have for me as someone who's thinking about this career field? What can I do now to make myself as marketable as possible for the future? And so we'll be doing this virtually in breakout sessions. So all of these event details are on Handshake. And yeah.
Real quick, Kelly, would you want to also maybe mention briefly the First Gen series?
Yeah, I'll do a quick plug for the First Gen Career Series. So we created this series. It's 4 events. It's aimed for first generation students, so students who are the first in their families to pursue higher education. And today we actually have a keynote speaker, Adriana, who actually has her JD, but is actually working in consulting now. And she's first gen herself and has a lot of great insight to share with folks. So if you want to check that out, it will be from 3:30 to 5 o'clock today. And if you just type in first gen keynote, breaking down barriers, something along those lines, you'll be able to find it. And we'll also drop it in the chat in a little bit.
Alrighty, y'all. So that might have seemed a little quick, or it might have seemed like it took forever, but we hope that that was at least somewhat useful to you all to get you all thinking a little bit and get gears turning in your heads about what it's going to take to apply to law school. But of course, like I said, it's foundational knowledge. It's obviously not going to be end all be all. And we hope that we can continue conversations with you all on a one-on-one basis if you would be interested in doing that. But we're actually now going to be opening it up for questions. So if folks are interested in asking questions, we'll do our best to cover as many questions as possible. Feel free to type in your questions via the chat, and then we'll get to them as they come in the order that they're arriving in. So we're going to get started with that. Kelly, you want to take the first one about, it's actually a little hidden, but
yeah. think there was an LSAT question. That was the first one.
Yeah.
What is the consensus around taking the LSAT more than once? So obviously, I've mentioned earlier, try to take it one time if possible, just because across the board, law schools don't fully disclose how they view your scores. Some schools will take your highest score, some of them will average it out, others look for trends, etc. And the other thing is you don't want to be burnt out. It's a pretty tedious exam and you don't want to be taking it multiple times unless, like I said, there's a family emergency, mental health concerns, etc. And then the other thing I share with students is LSAT grants me permission to view my students' scores on the back end. And what I've noticed is, especially this is the case for students who take it back to back within a short period of time, students usually hope to do like say 3 to 5 points higher their second or third attempts. And in that short time period, they usually aren't able to achieve that. They usually score about the same or about 1 to 2 points lower. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to get burnt out. And then the other thing is, like I mentioned, schools don't really fully disclose how they view your scores. And after you take it multiple times, you're going to want to include an addendum. Usually it's a 1 to 2 short paragraph section explaining any discrepancies or anything that raises any red flags. So those are just some things to keep in mind. And then I'll take the next question, which is, should we have multiple personal statements? Yes and no. Because the prompt is pretty much the same across the board, you'll probably just have one version. But of course, the length differs school by school. So you might have like a longer version, and then you might want to cut it down for schools that are very strict on the 2 double-space page limit. But across the board, what you're talking about in your personal statement's probably going to stay constant.
You want to take on that next one too? Because I'm actually not as
Sure.
familiar with that.
Sure. The candidate referral service is essentially a service on LSAC. So when you create a profile, they ask you like, would you like us to share information like your information, citizenship, gender, race, socioeconomic status, etc., with law school so that they can kind of like learn more about you, especially if they're targeting certain groups of students, right? So you can opt into that and it's completely free and you just do it directly through LSAC.
I'll take the next one in terms of should students have or should you have multiple personal statements? Oh, sorry, I totally missed the question. It's in our personal statement. Should we describe what we plan to do with our law degree? It's definitely not a bad idea to do that actually, because I think it demonstrates that you've really put some thought into your process of why you want to go to law school, right? Schools really want to make sure that students are prepared and committed to what is expected for law students and what's to come even after law school. So if you feel that that could actually help strengthen your case, by all means include that. But don't feel like you have to necessarily include that because some students might not even know what they want to do exactly. And that's also totally okay. You don't have to have a concrete, specific answer for schools because ideally through your time in law school, you're going to be figuring some of those things out. So you can definitely include that if you feel certain about where you want to go, but it's definitely not a requirement. And then I'll take the next one in terms of the gap year. So if we're taking a gap year, can we store our letters of rec on CAS for the following year? Or will they need to be saved on an external service? We used to have an external service actually, right, Kelly? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, we used to have something called letter service where you could store your letters until you're ready to apply. And now we've been recommending that students use Interfolio. So it's spelled Interfolio, and I'll link it after. But yeah, you basically want to store it on Interfolio until you're ready to apply. LSAT can wipe out your data year after year, so you just want to make sure it's safe. And then while we're on the topic of letters of rec, if you are planning to take gap year or gap years, think about whether you want to reach out to your professors like around graduation and have those letters in hand. Sometimes, students run into the issue of like the professor doesn't remember me or I can't get in contact with them or they're on sabbatical, etc. So I think just to play it safe, you might want to think about, requesting that they actually write the letter, shortly after graduation so they don't forget you.
Then the following question about the professionals of color panel, will there be Latinx and Black panelists specifically? So we're hoping to have a wide array of folks from different backgrounds and experiences. but ultimately it's also dependent on folks' capacity, right, to be able to be present for the date and time that we're going to be outreaching to them with. So, or we've outreached to. So we're hoping to really have folks from very different backgrounds, which would hopefully include Latinx and Black folks. But again, it's all dependent on their availability as well. So we're hoping to have a good mix of folks.
Yeah, I would recommend checking the Handshake events page. We'll put the list of panelists about a week or so prior to the event so you can kind of see who will be at the event. And I'll take the next question, which is how do you make the most out of admissions meetings and LSAT forums? Essentially, you just want to make a good impression. This is just an opportunity for you to engage with admissions folks. So come prepared. Do your research about the school in advance. Don't go in and say like, hey, tell me about this when it's very clearly something that's on their website. You could take that question and ask, more specifically, this is what I want to know. So make a good impression just because law school admissions officers do say that they note things about students, especially if a student is rude or, has a very negative impression, etc. They sometimes will make note of that. So come prepared and have questions ready for them and just like be willing to share things about what you're doing, your interests, etc. But this is primarily a time for you to gather information.
Quick brief addition to what Kelly added about or mentioned about admissions officers. Just know that admissions officers themselves can be your advocates if they are sitting in the admissions committee that is making decisions about whether or not you can get into the law school. So that first impression really is critical. So you want to make sure you're mindful of how you're presenting yourself, right? Because these are professionals, and you want to also ideally be, professional in your approach. And of course, like Kelly mentioned too, if stuff is already on the website that could answer your questions, then that means you probably did not do enough to prepare for the session. So you definitely want to be mindful of that. And then will you be at a disadvantage if you decide to apply for law school right after your undergraduate studies instead of taking a gap year? That varies that's really on a case by case basis, dependent on each student's situation. We generally, I personally am an advocate of gap time myself, mostly because we know that it could be difficult to balance prepping for the LSAT, for example, and prepping for your application process on top of your academics at Berkeley, right? You don't want to neglect your academics at Berkeley because ultimately they're still going to be a part of the decision-making process for whether or not you're even going to get admitted to law schools. So if it means that it's going to hinder you academically if you're trying to prep for law school, I would personally suggest maybe considering taking a little bit of time off to be able to have that time to devote to the process. Because as we've noted, the process is time consuming. The LSAT or GRE or both, the process for just that alone can take some time. So you definitely want to be strategic and mindful of that. But ultimately, it's up to you. If you feel like you're ready and you can take it on, depending what your circumstances are, then by all means. But if you feel like you want to take some time off, then that's also okay.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that really quickly. With your gap years, you can really do anything. They don't have to be aligned with the legal field. Very commonly students will pursue legal assistant roles at a law firm of choice. But then other students will join the Peace Corps or they'll teach English abroad when that was possible and in the future. And then other students, I've had them work non-tech roles in tech. So really anything that you're interested in, you can pursue.
Do we have to send in AP scores even if our credits from them are summarized in our transcript? Generally, that's not a problem because they usually are already reflected on your college transcripts. It'd be important though to make sure you're submitting all transcripts from all institutions you're attending. So even if you only attended a community college, for example, for one or two classes, you would be expected to submit those, right? For example, or you've gone to multiple different types of institutions, you would be submitting work for all of them. And that would include, say, for example, things like study abroad.
I can take the next one. Do we have to indicate what type of law we're interested in when we apply? So if you already have a good idea and you're very interested in, say, I don't know, corporate law or environmental law, by all means, indicate that and tell them why. But if you're someone that's still exploring and doesn't know exactly what they want to do, that's okay. They don't expect you to know right then and there. And a lot of times, students will pursue summer clerkships when they're in law school or different experiential learning opportunities. So it may change. You might want to go into a different field. So if you do have something in mind and you want to share, please do so. But if you don't, that's okay as well.
Yeah, so I think that question and then the follow-up question or the next question that talks a little bit about internships, a little bit about business and corporate law specifically. I think they tie in together a little bit because ultimately, remember, they don't have to necessarily always align with whatever field of law you're trying to study. If you want to do that, by all means do that because it could help you maybe parse out whether or not that really is the right field for you. But say, for example, someone that's looking to explore business or corporate law, maybe you would want to look into interning for a particular, legal office for a large company or a small business. That could help you decide whether or not that would really be the field that you would want to pursue long term. So it doesn't have to be strictly that, though. Just know that there's nothing that's set in stone necessarily that tells you that you have to do that. But if you can align those things, I think by all means do that. In terms of resources, of course, the Career Center is a really great place to stop by at to learn more about opportunities. LinkedIn is also a good resource for you to maybe connect with alumni or even other current students that are in particular sites you're thinking about possibly entering. So you could always reach out to these people for informational interviews to get a better sense of what it's going to take for you to enter that either company or organization.
Yeah, to add on to that, use Handshake. It's a really great platform to look for internships and part-time opportunities or full-time opportunities if you're open to that. And then we also have a page on our website. It's called Jobs and Internships in Law and Policy. So there are some different resources and job sites on there as well. And then I think the other piece is just reaching out to alums through the alumni LinkedIn alumni feature. What you can do a lot of times is kind of look at their online like digital resume or profile and kind of look at what they did during undergrad, right? So maybe they pursued an internship that's kind of aligned with corporate law. Maybe you want to see if that company offers those internships currently, or you want to reach out to them and say like, hey, would you be willing to tell me a little bit more about how you secured this role? Perhaps what was the interview process like? What was the actual duties and what were the duties and responsibilities and whatnot? And from there, you'll be able to uncover a lot of good nuggets of information.
In terms of do law schools have interviews and what is the process like? So generally, students will be invited into interviews if they've advanced in the process of being admitted, right? So increasingly more so for the sake of equity and access, schools are doing virtual interviews. So in the past, often schools would either somewhat subsidize or fully subsidize students who they wanted to interview. They would provide financial support for them to actually visit the school and have an in-person interview. But because that's not always fully accessible to students, they're increasingly moving towards virtual interviews. So virtual interviews really are generally a way for schools to get to know you more, right? To put a face to the name of the application that they read. And ultimately, you want to really think about general interview and etiquette, right? And the kind of presentation you want to convey to the law admissions folks that are going to be interviewing you. And generally, the interviewers are going to be either the director of admissions or an admissions officer that sits in the committee that will then essentially parse out, right, uh, the conversation you have and essentially either advocate for your advancement and admission ultimately. But it's really dependent on the school, right? Because each school might have their own different protocol for interviews. But just know that generally, if you got an interview, it's because the school wants to get to know you a little more, and wants to perhaps advance you into being admitted, but they want to get to know more about who you are.
So the next question is, what types of clubs or organizations at Cal are law students or law school applicants frequently involved with? There are actually a lot of great pre-law organizations on campus. For instance, there's PAD, and then there are affinity groups like the Latinx Pre-Law Association. They actually did a pre-law orientation, I think 2 weeks ago, and there's a really great PowerPoint deck with all of the different organizations and kind of highlights. So we'll make sure to also share that with you all after as well, so you can kind of look through that. And then other things to be involved with on Cal, at Cal, include like the ASCC Legal Clinic. That's a really great opportunity. Their applications unfortunately just closed, I think last week, but that's something to look into for a future academic year. What they do is provide community-based resources to folks. And what you'd be doing is writing a lot of like case reports, doing a bit of research. So all important skills that law schools are looking for. So definitely check that out. And then there are some off-campus opportunities as well with some community-based organizations and nonprofits, such as Bay Area Legal Aid, the East Bay Sanctuary Covenant, and all of those are included in the introductory guide. So check that out after.
In terms of diversity statements, just so you know that generally schools make that an optional statement. If you can submit something, I think by all means you should think about submitting something, because it could add additional context, right, to who you are and where you're coming from and the kind of work you've done over time. And generally, the guidelines are going to vary by campus in terms of length. So there is no specific fixed amount of words or pages necessarily. It could vary by school. So generally, it isn't too long. It could be about a page, give or take, if you want to have an estimate. But it's going to vary in size, really. So just make sure you do your research dependent on the school, right? So if you're applying to specific schools that ask for it as an optional statement, by all means, I would say if you can submit something. So in terms of length, though, it's going to vary.
Next question. The majority of internship programs I've seen require you to be a first-year law student at least. I can't find any internship opportunities for pre-law students in the legal field. Yeah, that definitely can be tricky when you look through a lot of positions, or some positions, I mean, on Handshake and all these different platforms. They'll say like current law student requested. I would recommend using the filters to specify undergrad as opposed to graduate student. And then just know a lot of the legal assistant positions don't require you to be a graduate student or a current law student. So that would be where I would start, and then look through the list of different opportunities in the introductory guide. There's a lot of great resources there.
And just a quick addition to that, I think what you might be alluding to is actually the kinds of legal internships that are expected generally of law students. Because the summers, for example, of students 1L year or the 2L year, the summer after that year, those are really critical times for students to start looking into law firms and doing internships at law firms, because ultimately that could be a way for students to start getting employed. Students will generally look to doing legal internships those summers within the time between their 1L year and 2L year, or after their 2L year, so they can ideally get hired by the firm. So I think you might be alluding to that a little bit, and those obviously would be a little more restrictive because they are for law students specifically. So in terms of pre-law internship options, just know that there's a lot of varied options that you have. It could be as a legal assistant at a firm or at a nonprofit. You could be doing advocacy work in a variety of organizations. I would just say definitely take the time to explore either via LinkedIn or Handshake what your options look like. And actually, Kelly, would you want to answer that LSAT Flex one, or I can touch up on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, we missed that one. You can touch upon it.
So the LSAT Flex, the thing is that with COVID, right, a lot of tests not, I guess, test offering organizations, or the organizations that essentially run uh, graduate and even undergraduate examination. I'm sure you've probably seen this with, the College Board, SAT, ACT. You're seeing this with the GRE. You're seeing this with LSAT and even the MCAT for med schools, for example. They've had to really be flexible about how they're offering the exam. So the flex is really just a way for students to take it online at home. And generally, as you know, you would have to go to a specific site to take the exam. So the scoring system is the same. It actually might be slightly shorter, actually, if I recall correctly. So the evaluation process is going to be the same. The scoring system is going to be the same. It's just really a way for students to be able to access it at home, for example, versus you actually having to go to a testing site. Do you want to add to that, Kelly?
Just that, yeah, it's shorter. It's going to be 3 35-minute sections, and then there's still the writing section, writing portion at the end as well. And with the writing section, they're really just kind of gauging like your writing abilities. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the LSAT Flex. And then I'll take the last one, which is, do law schools have an opinion on students graduating early / in 3 years? It really depends. With higher education becoming increasingly expensive, not all students can afford to do 4 years or choose not to. So there might be a variety of reasons as to why students want to finish up their undergrad degree in 3 years. And from the law school side, they're really looking for a very holistic candidate, or they're looking holistically at your application. So if you did graduate in 3 years, did you pursue different opportunities to explore the field or explore other career fields and whatnot? So I would say, it really depends.
Any other questions for us? We do actually have quite a bit of time left. I think we breezed through that presentation really quickly. So we definitely wanted to also, though, make sure you all had time to ask questions directly to us if you had any, because it might not always be easy to book us via an advising appointment too. So definitely take advantage of the time. How do we make an appointment? So for LNS advising, if you go to our website, lsadvising.berkeley.edu, you'll be able to get advice on how to set an appointment there. I'll try to set the link after I finish. Okay, there you go. Thank you for posting that. So yeah, you can use that. You can book me link to set up an appointment with myself or Kelly via Handshake. So yeah, feel free to book an appointment with us. And of course, it's the beginning of the semester, so it could be a little busier on our end. But if you wait it out a little longer, you might be able to actually find us more easily on the booking system, since it's going to start slowing down a little bit soon.
Yeah, on our end, the Career Center usually is pretty busy during the first 6 weeks of school or the semester, so it might be a little bit difficult to find an appointment, but check back frequently. I post new appointment blocks Friday afternoons so that there are 3 full weeks of appointments available for students. And then during the first 6 weeks, we also offer same-day mini appointments. So those are scheduled day of at 9 a.m. And I do mini appointments Mondays and Wednesdays. So just keep that in mind. And then yes, this session will be recorded and it will be posted on our YouTube channel. All of our events are being posted on YouTube, usually like a week after the event. So just check back then.
Yeah, and real quick also about our specific advising appointment system. We generally only book out 72 hours prior to the actual appointment time and date. So let's say you're trying to book at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday, you would have to look that up 72 hours prior, right? So for me specifically, I actually don't see students on Wednesdays, for example. I will usually only see students Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. And I tend to get booked pretty quickly. So if you're trying to book, I definitely encourage you to just look it up earlier rather than later. For example, I'm already booked for this week. So if you want to book on Monday, for example, maybe on the weekend, you would want to start looking.
And I'll take the question on Interfolio. So yes, from my understanding, you should be able to send, you'll have the professor GSI write the letter, store it on Interfolio, and then once you're ready to apply, you'll go through Interfolio and request that they send the specific letters to LSAC. So yes.
So the next question, I'm interested in intellectual property law. Is there anything I could get involved with at Berkeley that is related to that, to IP? IP and patent law, for example, is a very, very specialized field. I'm actually, to be honest, not very familiar with the process of getting involved with IP. But generally, a lot of times when students are interested in IP, they'll be looking to work with tech. So if you're interested in IP, perhaps you maybe want to explore working with a tech company or getting an internship at a tech company, because they'll be able to help you navigate those processes. With patent law specifically, I know that there's a rigorous examination process through the US federal government that you would actually need to get certified through. And they have pretty strict criteria also about the kinds of classes you should be taking. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I would definitely encourage you to do a little bit of research with the US US federal government patent office as it pertains to intellectual or patent law. Do you have anything to add on that, Kelly? I'm not as familiar with IP as much, to be honest.
No, that's all good information. If you want to uncover additional openings, again, I would recommend reaching out to alums and current law students and start asking, how do I go about finding these opportunities? And they will probably have more insight for you as well. So building your network and reaching out is definitely really important in this process.
And just a quick note, again, I kind of alluded to this already earlier. With IP law, students often come from a STEM background. So something to think about in terms of your major path here at Cal, and something to consider as you move forward with exploring IP. Any other questions, folks? We actually still have a bit of time, so feel free to keep them coming. Since there's no more questions, I'm assuming you're all very capable and ready to apply to law school then?
Well, I'm going to stop recording. Thank you all for coming to this event, and we'll stick around if you have any additional questions, either in the chat or feel free to turn on your video as well. Thanks, everyone.